Welcome to Lunch with the Lord. I'm Pastor Mark. We are in 1 Timothy chapter 5. We will be looking at verse 11 this lesson and maybe even getting into verse 12. But before we begin, Jeremiah 15:16. Thy words were found, and I did eat them, and thy word was unto me the joy and the rejoicing of my heart. Now, as we begin verse 11, he says here, but the younger widows refuse, for when they have begun to wax wanton against Christ, they will marry. Now, as we approach verse 11, we have to understand that during this time in history, the time that these letters were written, that it was almost impossible for a young woman or for a widow to earn a living. There were next to no trades or professions available for her. The culture at the time of Paul and Jesus and the culture at that time was much different than it is today. In our culture, it's much easier for a woman to find a job. She can go to school, she can go online and go to college, and even if you don't have college, you leave high school and you can go to a store and they'll hire you. And it's much, much easier today for a woman to find work. And I think it's very, in our culture today, even in cultures throughout the world, it's difficult for us to understand the hardships that women went through in this time, the time of Christ, the time of Paul. And it's hard, difficult for us to imagine what it was like for a woman. What do you mean that she can't find it work, or there's she can't, there's opportunities aren't available to them? What do you mean? It's like we don't understand that, but this is the way it was. The result was that these women and these widows were almost forced to take up prostitution in order to live. That's how difficult it was. Now, was it possible that there were wealthy men in their town or in their city who needed slave, I shouldn't say slave, but say maids to work in the house, to clean the house and do the menial jobs? Sure, there were, but these rich men couldn't hire all of the women. So there was really, other than working for someone rich who had money to pay, if you were a single woman or a widow, there was basically nothing for you to do except go out and get married again. For a Christian woman growing up at these times, she had to either marry or devote her life to the service of the church. And there were really no other options. As a Christian woman, she wasn't going to go out and sell herself to provide for her welfare. But some widows, because of the influence of their husbands, because their husbands has just recently died, and because of their husband's death was still fresh on their mind, they would dedicate their lives to the church. A woman, she's married and her husband dies, and she's brokenhearted because of that. And now she wants to devote her life to the church. Maybe she's in her 30s or late 20s, or maybe she's in her 40s, and she's like, well, the shock of her husband dying has caused her to want to devote herself to the church. But then after some time has passed, now that her husband has died, maybe 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3, 5 years, whatever later, she would desire to get married again. And because of that, she would bring reproach to herself and also to the church. Because now people would look at her and say, well, your husband died X amount of time ago, and now you've devoted yourself to the church. You were so adamant, I'm going to live the rest of my life to the church. I'm never going to marry again. I'm going to give myself to God and to the church, right? And then some time passes, and that desire within her has come back again. Maybe there's a man in the church, handsome man, or maybe he's got, a good job and he's making money, and she sees him as a provider and he's single, and she wants to marry again. Well, there's nothing wrong with that, but because years ago she decided she was going to devote her life to the church and to God, now she wants to go back on that devotion and get married again. That decision that she makes would bring reproach to herself and also to the church. And Paul instructs Timothy to not have these young widows to be enrolled as part of the number of the to be taken care of by the church. He's saying don't enroll them as part of the women who would be taken care of by the church. Let them marry again. And this is what he says here in verse 11. But the younger widows refuse them. Don't take them on as a burden of the church to take care of them. For when they have begun to wax wanton against Christ, they will marry. And this Greek word for wax wanton is katastrenao. Katastrenao. And kata means down, and stranio means to run riot, or to live strenuously, or rudely. So there are two main interpretations to this Greek word. The first interpretation is that it means to feel the impulses of sexual desire rising up within you. All right? So that's the first one, is that these younger widows would, after a time, after their husbands have died, they would begin to have sexual impulses again rising up. But the second interpretation to katastrenao is this, is that to live wildly, or to live without restraint. Because of their youth, they have not experienced enough trials in their life to help them appropriately approach life. They are still young and energetic and want to live life to the full. Therefore, they cannot be trusted to dedicate themselves fully to the church. So whichever one you decide it is, it could be both. It can have both meanings. So Paul here says, but the younger widows refuse them. Why? Because eventually they're going to have the desire to get married and have sex again. Or they're young and maybe they don't really want to get married again, but they just want to go out and live life and live it to the full. Doesn't mean in a sinful way, but it just means they want to enjoy life and be free. Maybe they have financial stability and their husbands have provided for them, and maybe they don't need a husband and they just want to go out and enjoy life. And Paul said those kind of women, don't accept them in. They don't need help. The ones, let them marry. or let them enjoy life. Now, verse 12 says, having damnation because they have cast off their first faith. So, verses 11 and 12 are connected. It says, but the younger widows refuse, for when they have begun to wax wanton against Christ, they will marry. Verse 12, having damnation. Now, damnation here, the Greek word is krima, and it means judgment or condemnation. And actually, the English word damnation is a bad translation in this context of krima, okay? Because it implies almost that they would lose their salvation if they go out and get married again, or if they have, sexual desires within their heart, that they lose their salvation. And that's not what Paul is talking about here. Having damnation. It should say, the Greek here should say that it's having, the English translation of the Greek should say having reproach or judgment. So these young widows, having first, they dedicated themselves to the church. Soon after their husbands died, they decided, I'm going to dedicate my life to the church, right? So first, they dedicate their life to the church, but after they've done that, then they go back on their dedication. Now they want to get married again, and they bring reproach to themselves and to the church. So he says here, they wax wanton against Christ, and they will marry again, and having damnation because they have cast off their first faith. And cast off here, the Greek word is atheteo, and it means to set something aside. It means to reject something or to make something void. So it would be like you make an agreement with someone, and then after you make the agreement, you go back on the agreement. You decide you're not going to fulfill the agreement. And that's what's happening here. By dedicating their lives to the church, these widows, by dedicating their lives to the church, there was basically an unwritten agreement that they would not marry again, and that they would be wholly given to God. But now they want to marry again, and they would make void, they would cast aside their agreement to God and to the church. That's what it's saying here. It does not mean that they cast off their faith completely and they reject God and the church and go back into the world. No. What it means here is that when their husbands have died, they've decided that they're going to give their life and their life to the church and to the work of God. And now, sometime later, they decide, I want to go back on that. I want to cast it off. I want to do away with that agreement that I made with the church. And I want to go back into marriage. All right? And so doesn't mean that they've lost their salvation. It doesn't mean that they turn their backs on the church. It just means that they want to not be wholly given to the church. They want to be married again and go back into a married life again. All right? So this is what Paul is describing here. So he says, having damnation, or because they have cast off their first faith. They've cast off their dedication to God, and now they're turning away from their dedication to God. Doesn't mean that they stop going to church. No. It just means they don't want to be wholly given to the church. They don't want their life to be committed to the church and to the service of God. Now they want to marry and commit their life to this new husband. All right? And still go to church and still be active in the church, but they want the husband to. All right? We'll get into the next lesson. All right. Until then, walk with the Lord. I know He walks with you.